In the previous video, What Makes Entrepreneurs Tick, we considered a series of traits that make entrepreneurs able to do successfully their business ventures. And the point there was that to the extent that entrepreneurs embody, and act consistently upon traits like these ones here, creative knowledge, ambition, perseverance, a commitment to productivity, and so forth, they're more likely to be successful in their entrepreneurial ventures. And the point is not that all entrepreneurs all the time embody all of these traits consistently. It's a degree point, and it's setting a set of standards for us to aspire to, things to work on in ourselves, to develop a certain sets of traits and habits that are going to enable us to be successful as entrepreneurs. Now, what does this have to do with ethics? One way of speaking of business ethics is to connect ethical values to virtues. And when we talk about virtues, we talk about generalized character traits, habits, policies of action, predispositions that enable people to act well or to act virtuously, so hence the name, virtue ethics. And what I want to do is connect the business practice literature, where we're asking the question, what makes it possible for me practically to be successful in the real world of business, to a set of virtues. And the argument there is going to be that virtue and virtuous behavior is embedded in business practice, and we see that most exaggerated and stylized in the case of entrepreneurs. Now, this is all fairly controversial because within the business ethics literature, there's been a long-standing divide between two sides over the relationship between business and ethics. Obviously, business ethics is a hybrid discipline. We study business as a practice. We study ethics as a set of theories. And the question is, what's the connection between business and ethics? And one position, a fairly common position, has been what is known as the separation thesis. And the thesis here, as the name suggests, is that when we are considering what enables practicality or success in the business world, that is a separate set of categories, or a separate set of principles from the kinds of principles that we consider when we are doing ethics, ethical theory, and so forth. So what we have is what it is to be ethical and how we decide what that is and enunciate what the principles are. That is a separate venture from the question of figuring out what makes business practical, successful, and so forth. And then having done those two separate projects, we might ask, what's the relationship between the results that we find having done each of these projects? And they're advocates of the separation thesis, divide again into two. One position will argue that what it is to be business is essentially amoral, but nonetheless, it is possible to add, so to speak, some ethical criteria to business practice and to achieve some sort of blending, so to speak. Another more radical version, of the separation thesis says that what we find when we study ethics, what it is to be a good person, and what we find when we study business and what it is to be successful in business, that those two things are opposed to each other. That what it is to be successful in business means necessarily that one acts unethically, rather. And that if you are going to be an ethical person, then necessarily you're going to be the kind of person who's not going to be successful in business. And so what we then have is either the position that business is not moral or immoral, of itself, it's just a purely amoral enterprise, or the stronger version of the separation thesis that says that business is by its nature an immoral activity. And if it's an immoral activity, then of course the project of business ethics is to rein in or put a stop to or try to change fundamentally the nature of this immoral business enterprise. So you probably have heard the phrase business ethics is an oxymoron, or business ethics, that's a contradiction in terms. Sometimes people just throw that out rather as a toss-away joke. But if we take that seriously, that's a strong form of the separation thesis. What I'm going to be arguing today is that the separation thesis is false, and I'm only going to be giving one way to respond to the separation thesis, but what I'll be arguing for is a version of the integration thesis. That is to say, very fundamentally or very deeply or very essentially, built into successful business practice is good ethics. And so that is to say, ethics and business are fundamentally integrated, and we should see, to use a metaphor, business practice to the extent that it's successful, that it's an organic, development of ethical traits with business practice that enable the success of that business, in the first place. All right, let's take first the traits of knowledge and creativity. And there the argument on the business side is that if you're going to be successful in business, you have to know a lot. And what you think you know actually has to, or more often than not, be correct. And then entrepreneurs also typically act creatively, thinking about new possibilities for ventures, innovation, right, and so forth. Now, if we think in terms of virtues, right, we can connect the exercise of creativity and the acquisition of knowledge to what philosophers call the virtue of rationality. And rationality as a virtue, right, is a commitment to using one's mind to the best extent that one possibly can. Always seeking out new knowledge, always evaluating and re-evaluating the beliefs that one has to ensure that they are knowledge or the closest thing that one can to knowledge, to be committed to thinking creatively about new possibilities in the acquisition of knowledge, right, and so forth. So there's a connection then between virtue of rationality and the acquisition, right, of knowledge and creativity. All right, now we take up the trait of ambition, right? Some people are more or less ambitious, but typically if you're going to be an entrepreneur, then you need to be ambitious, right? You want to have your business life, your career be the best that it possibly can be, and you have enough ambition to actually take these steps to start your own business, right, and make it successful. Now we can connect that to a virtue, right, in some ethical traditions, right, called pride. And obviously within ethics, the status of pride is controversial, but the Aristotelian tradition that I'm going to draw upon here is a long-standing tradition that says pride is in fact a virtue, taking pride in oneself. Pride has sometimes a backward-looking component. One does something of which one is proud, so I'm proud of what I have done. But pride also, as a virtue, can have a forward-looking component, right? Wanting to be the best that one can be. So, for example, we might say taking pride in one's appearance, right? That involves then a commitment to thinking about standards of hygiene, thinking about standards of health, exercise, fashion issues, right, and so forth. And so we can understand, or we can identify rather, a person who is taking pride in their appearance, right, so to speak. So if pride then is wanting, in a generalized sense, the best for oneself in the future and making a commitment to become the best that one can be, that connects with the entrepreneur's trait of ambition, wanting the best in the narrower subset of his or her life, his or her business career. Now let's take up initiative. Obviously, for an entrepreneurial venture to happen, someone has to decide not only just that it's a good business idea, I would like if it happened, but actually to take the steps to get off the sofa, to do what is necessary to make the business happen. And people vary in their degrees of initiative, right, in all walks of life, including the business step. Now we can connect then initiative, right, the step of translating what one thinks is a good idea into actual practice, with the virtue of integrity, right, what moral philosophers call integrity. And the principle of integrity, right, as a character trait is an integration, right, to speak abstractly, right, of what's going on in one's mind with what one's body actually does, right? That is to say, what you think is good is what you actually do, right? Or what you think is true, that's actually what you say. So you're integrating theory, right, with practice, right? Or you're integrating your beliefs about what is good with the actions, right, that you take to achieve the good in the world. Obviously, the opposite of being a person of integrity, right, is being a hypocrite in varying degrees. A hypocrite is someone who believes one thing but fails to act on it, or does the opposite, right, of what he or she believes to be the case. So if one is a person of integrity, right, that's going to be then a generalized policy of acting on the basis of what one believes to be true or good, and a business person, right, taking the steps of trying to bring about what he or she thinks is a good business plan into actual practice. That initiative step connects then to integrity. All right, now let's take up, right, guts. Obviously, entrepreneurship involves some risk, and in many cases, the reason why people don't become entrepreneurs is out of fear, right? They fear the financial risk, they fear looking foolish, they fear seeing themselves as a failure should the entrepreneurial venture, right, not work out. But if one is strong enough to committed to the idea of one's entrepreneurial venture, then one will, so to speak, screw up one's guts and make the gutsy move and try as best one can to succeed in one's venture. Now here we can connect guts to the virtue that the moral philosophers, right, will call, right, courage. Right, and then courage, of course, is a component of life. It's a significant component of life because all of life involves risks. We never can guarantee the outcomes in many cases because we don't know all of the factors, right, at work, or we don't control all of the factors that are involved in a given situation. So courage is a generalized trait that we all need to be able to take on the risk that life offers. So in particular, right, an entrepreneur, right, who is willing, right, despite the hopefully conscious awareness of the risks that he or she is facing in the business venture, is nonetheless able to courageously not let the fear of failure in various forms prevent him or her from doing what she thinks is good. All right, now let's take up perseverance. Perseverance as a success trait, right, in business. In one way, this is fairly obvious. Business success is almost never overnight, and instead, typically, it's a matter of long hours, dealing with many frustrations, right, being tired, experiencing disapproval or naysaying from other people, right, along the way. And the entrepreneur who is going to be successful typically then will persevere right through all of those obstacles and difficulties. We can connect perseverance to what the philosophers call the trait of independence, right, or the virtue, right, of independence. And the trait of independence is independently, right, as it suggests, trusting one's own mind, trusting one's own judgment, trusting one's own abilities in order to be able to get the thing done. So rather than your opinion about what your capacities are being dependent upon the opinion of other people, one makes one's own judgment and acts on the basis, right, of that. Or, of course, also we have self-doubt moments. We get tired, and in many cases, our tiredness, right, or certain emotions, right, that we are experiencing, can lead us to not do what we think we need to do in order to be successful. Independence also has a component of not, so to speak, giving into one's own tiredness or one's own self-doubt, rather having confidence, having independent judgment that I do need to keep working through the tiredness, say, keep working through my doubts, right, at any given time, and independently, right, pursue my vision of what needs to be done. So to the extent that independence of mind and independence, right, of judgment is a good generalized trait, right, in life, we can see that in highlighted fashion as the entrepreneur works through persevering the difficulties of bringing the venture to fruition. Okay, now let's turn to trial and error. Right, in most cases, there are many adjustments that have to go along in any new business. Sometimes the entrepreneur will try something that's just not working, and he or she has to go back to the drawing board and start dramatically over. Or in many cases, some things are working, other things are not working, and the entrepreneur needs to be able to say, these things are not working, I'm going to tweak them or change them and evolve the plan, right, in various directions. Now, that willingness to commit to and work through the trial and error process that most new businesses involve can be connected to the trait that philosophers will call, right, objectivity. And here I especially want to single out, right, the trait of honesty. Now, objectivity, right, is the policy of committing to the awareness of facts as facts and letting the content of one's mind, right, be guided to your best judgment of what the facts actually are. Right, as opposed to wishful thinking, right, or having a pet idea and not being willing really to put that pet idea right to the test. Instead, being willing to say the facts are the facts. Here's the idea that I had, and sometimes I will make mistakes. Sometimes I do need to change my mind or alter my hypothesis, right, in various ways. And a person who makes that commitment, which is obviously an important commitment in all areas of one's life, that person has the virtue of objectivity. And a way of tweaking out one major component, right, of objectivity is to talk about, right, honesty. Dishonest people obviously lie, but also people can lie to themselves. They can ignore something that they need to pay attention to, and they know that they're ignoring paying attention to it. They can tell them little stories, tell themselves little stories or rationalizations, and all of those minor, in some cases, dishonesties, or in some cases, serious dishonesties, undercut objectivity. And the point then is, if you don't have the virtue of objectivity, if you are dishonest, especially to yourself, then you're not going to engage in the trial and error process. You're not going to make the adjustments in the real world that you need to, and your business is not going to be, right, successful. Successful entrepreneurs typically are people who are honest about the facts of the business world that they're dealing with. They make objective assessments, right, when necessary, and that generalized traits enables them success in their entrepreneurial ventures. Okay, turning to productivity, obviously an essential business trait if one's going to be, right, successful. Right, one has to get the prototype done. One has to close the contract. One has to make the sale. One has to scale up. The extent to which one is able, right, successfully to engage in actual acts of productivity, one is then to that extent successful in the business world. Now that doesn't happen automatically, so when we're speaking about virtues, right, or character traits as human beings, we need to make a commitment, right, to being productive. And that commitment we call in the ethics literature the commitment, right, to productiveness. And productiveness is a generalized trait in all areas of life. Right, we engage in various projects, right, things that need to happen. Many of these projects are long-term projects, so they're complicated projects with very many components, and we need to be making a commitment to seeing it through, right, getting it done, right, and so forth. And most of us will struggle, particularly on more difficult and longer-term projects, with what's sometimes called the last 10%. The first 90% of a project is work, right? But in many cases, it's easier work. You're more energized by it. But to be able to finish that project, to see it through, and to see it through successfully at the highest level of quality, right, one can. That commitment, right, of productiveness is essential. So carrying that commitment over to the particular area of the life that we call the business life, being productive in a business or economic sense, there's a strong connection there. All right, finally on the list here, trading value for value. The whole idea of a business transaction is that it's a mutually advantageous transaction between a buyer and a seller, or a producer, right, and a consumer. That the producer creates things that have value, right, to consumers. The consumers bring value to the table, either money that they're going to exchange for it, or in a barter system, other goods and services that are going to be exchanged for it. But the idea here is that both parties are voluntarily trading with each other according to their best judgment of the value of the products or services that are involved, and they walk away happy, right, from the transaction. Now the connection to a virtue here is to the virtue of justice. Justice is a very broad, right, abstract virtue in the and value in the ethics literature, but in this case here, right, the commitment to treating people fairly according to what they deserve, according to what they have earned, right, or sticking by the terms of the agreements that we have made, or my word being my bond if I have signed a contract. For sorting out what we owe each other, right, according to the agreements that we have made, and the policy of being committed to that, right, that is a commitment to justice in one's business transactions. So, trading value for value, treating people fairly according to the trades as agreed, that is an aspect, right, of the virtue of justice. All right, having talked about a series of virtues and connected them to entrepreneurial success traits, let's return to the broader debate within the business ethics literature. One of the positions there we call the Separation Thesis, and as that name suggests, it says that what it is to be practical, right, in the business world is a very different thing, or separate from what it is to be a moral or an ethical or a virtuous person. And the argument that I've made today is to argue that that position is false, that there are deep connections between moral virtue and practical business success. So, if we, for example, take this list of traits over here in the blue, what we're calling entrepreneurial traits, these are the traits that enable people to be successful, right, in their entrepreneurial ventures. And the thesis that we can say is that to the extent that you have creative knowledge, that you have ambition, that you have guts, that you persevere, that you are productive, right, and so forth, these are the kinds of traits that will enable one to be a practical person, right? In the practical business world, one will achieve one's goals, right, more often than not, and so forth. Now, consider this list of virtues over here, right? Here we have traits that we think are morally admirable, right? And to the extent that one embodies these traits, one should have a healthy self-respect. Other people will respect you. You will be what we consider to be a moral person. You will act in a way in the world that we think is ethical. So we say Cumulatively, right, a person who embodies, right, a commitment to these virtues is a moral person. And the point that I'm wanting to make here about business ethics is that these are amounting to the same thing. When we are talking about what it is to be practical, right, in the real world, what we are talking about is a particular application of a generalized set of moral traits. To the extent that one is, generally speaking, a virtuous person, it is those very traits that, when applied to one's business life or to one's entrepreneurial career, those same moral traits are the same traits that enable one to be practically successful, right? The practical is the moral is the practical. Those two traits are integrated, right, not separated.